For the first time in 12 years, the leaders of South Korea and Japan are meeting. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol seek to rebuild security and economic ties. What has brought two countries with historical distrust of each other together are two other countries in the region, China and North Korea. 12 years ago, neither Xi Jinping nor Kim Jong Un had yet come to power. So much has changed over the past decade. Now, Yoon and Kishida are signaling they want a fresh start. At the talks, the two agreed to resume, quote, shuttle diplomacy. They also agreed to settle a trade dispute related to compensation for Korean forced laborers during Japan's colonial rule. Meanwhile, Pyongyang responded to this meeting the way it often does, by firing a long-range ballistic missile. This one landed in the sea between the Korean peninsula and Japan. It's North Korea's third weapons test this week, including launches of medium-range rockets and 2 missiles from a submarine. Not exactly the most subtle message, though it's likely to have the opposite effect and only bring Tokyo and Seoul closer together. Joining us is journalist Frank Smith in Seoul. Frank, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That seems to be what's driving Japan and South Korea together. Talk about that.
Well, definitely the dual influence of the threats of North Korea and China are part of this, and certainly something that the U.S. looks at favorably as Washington wants to solidify that trilateral Japan-South Korea-U.S. alliance. Certainly the launch of a missile by North Korea, an ICBM today, emphasizes that fact. But the conservative President Yoon also wants to encourage business leaders here to develop stronger trade relations with Japan. And, several members of the business community did accompany him. And the South Korean government also, prior to this summit, made up a list of something like 100 joint projects it wants to pursue with Japan. So business as well as security is a big part of this.
The leaders of the two countries might understand why they need to strategically engage with each other. But given the strong emotions some people have about past wartime trauma, what do ordinary people in South Korea think?
Well, I think it really depends, who you talk to. Business people generally favor Yoon's outreach, but liberals, Yoon's a conservative. The left is a little bit more concerned about human rights and correcting history, shall we say. A recent Yoon administration plan for South Koreans and South Korean companies to compensate the forced laborers who worked in Japanese companies during the war and prior is opposed here in South Korea. By something like 60% of South Koreans, again, oppose this plan. Now, these different perspectives certainly are reflected in some of the things I heard from people on the streets of Seoul yesterday.
It's better for South Korea to compromise with Japan. And even if there are some difficulties, I think the South Korean government is doing well in this, considering that President Yoon is taking the first step.
잘하는 거라고 판단은 됩니다.
The president once said Japanese colonialism didn't respond well to changes in world history. So I'm worried about what humiliating diplomacy might emerge through the summit. If the government sincerely serves the elderly victims, it should urge the Supreme Court to implement the ruling so that compensation for Japanese war crimes from Japanese companies can be made as soon as possible.
So it sounds like Yoon will have to be mindful of his constituents. Frank, how is the South Korean president doing on the popularity front back home?
Well, this, the Japanese forced labor compensation plan has kind of hit his approval rating, which dipped below something like, what we could assume is a healthy sort of 40%, but it's dropped below that. And that seems to be, though, a price he's willing to pay. He said he's going to forge ahead with improving ties with Japan. And while South Korean presidents only serve a 5-year term, he's in his second year now, they are somewhat mindful of public opinion, as that can influence National Assembly elections and influence through that, the kind of legislation that he might want to pass. So he's going to have a National Assembly election here in 2024, and he's going to want to be in a good place in terms of public opinion at that time for sure.
Now, the meeting between the two sides will run into Friday. Any deliverables so far from these Japan-South Korea talks?
Well, just a couple of things. They have come to a couple of agreements in terms of business. The business leaders announced that they were going to create a fund for joint research and youth exchanges, and also on the sort of joint labor front. The sanctions that Japan levied against South Korea because of a previous court ruling on this forced labor issue, those sanctions are going to be dropped, and the corresponding suit that South Korea was bringing to the WTO is also going to be dropped. So they are kind of burying the hatchet a little bit in terms of the history, conflict. How long that will hold, I think, with again the public opinion that you see in South Korea opposed to this is going to be another question. I don't think one summit is going to do the trick.
Frank Smith, thank you so much.